There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over the mall on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, and if you've ever stood in it, really stood in it, not as a tourist with a camera raised, but just as a person breathing that cold, slightly damp London air, you'd know it's not peaceful. It's waiting. The whole street feels like it's holding its breath. I'd been standing near the eastern gate of Buckingham Palace for about 20 minutes before anything happened. That's not unusual. That's what you do there. You stand. You watch the guards do their thing. You feel slightly ridiculous for finding it as impressive as you do. The guard on the southern post that morning was a young man. Couldn't have been older than 24, 25 at most. Tall in that way that the bearskin hat exaggerates, though even without it, you got the sense he'd fill a doorway. He had the stillness that they train into those boys, the absolute refusal to be a human being in any visible way during a shift. Eyes fixed. Jaw set. Rifle at perfect vertical. I'd watched enough of these changings and postings over the years to know the difference between a guard who was performing stillness and a guard who has become it. This one had become it. His name, I would find out later, much later, after the whole thing had unraveled in the press and, in the whispers that travel faster than press, was Corporal James Whitmore. 23 years old. From Shropshire. Had a mother who sent him biscuits in the post every 3 weeks and a younger sister who'd posted a photograph of him at his first posting with the caption "My brother is literally a fancy statue" and gotten 14,000 likes. But, on that Tuesday morning, I didn't know any of that. I just knew he was still. And that the woman approaching the gate from the north side of the forecourt was not. She came with 2 others. That was the first thing you noticed, not her, but the formation. 3 people moving with that particular kind of purposeful casual that screams official to anyone who's spent more than 10 minutes watching how power actually moves through physical space. Not aggressive. Not hurried. Just utterly certain of its own right to be wherever it pointed itself. The woman in the center was wearing a gray coat. Good cut. The kind of coat that costs what a decent second-hand car costs, but nobody who knew anything about money would ever say so aloud. Her hair was dark at the roots and lighter at the ends, the way expensive maintenance looks when it's been neglected for a month. Late 50s, maybe 60. Carrying a leather folio, not a briefcase, not a bag, a folio, which is a very specific object to carry to a royal residence on a Tuesday morning. I clocked all of this in the time it took her to cross about 30 feet of forecourt. The 2 with her, 1 man, 1 woman, were younger. Functionary young. The kind of young where you can't quite tell if they're assistants or junior advisors or something else entirely, because they hold their faces in the same careful neutral as the people they work for. A couple near me, tourists, American by the accent, matching windbreakers, had their phone raised and were murmuring to each other about whether this was somebody important. Could be government, the man said. His partner shrugged. Could be press. Neither of them was right. The thing about Buckingham Palace is that it has multiple entry points, and which one you use says everything about why you're there and who you are in relation to the people inside. Tourists photograph the front. Staff use the side. Certain people, certain kinds of people with certain kinds of appointments, use a specific secondary gate that sits off to the side of the main forecourt, half obscured by the angle of the building and easy to miss if you don't know it's there. The woman in the gray coat was not heading for that gate. She was heading for the main post, where Corporal Whitmore was standing. I watched him see her coming. I know that sounds strange, he was facing forward, expression locked, not tracking movement, but there's a thing that happens with experienced guards where the body stays perfectly still and, yet somehow you can tell the person inside it has just updated their information. A micro-adjustment in the set of the shoulders. Nothing you could point to. Nothing a camera would catch. He saw her. And something in the quality of his stillness changed. She stopped about 8 feet from him. This is already unusual. The general public keeps a respectful distance from the palace guards, usually further than 8 feet, partly because of the signs and the rope barriers, partly because of the sheer physical intimidation of a man in full ceremonial dress holding a rifle. 8 feet is inside the comfortable zone. 8 feet is a number that says I have decided that the rules don't apply to me in the same way they apply to everyone else. The tourists noticed. The American couple lowered their phones slightly. A group of school children on the other side of the forecourt went momentarily quieter, the way children do when adult tension crackles into the air above their heads. She spoke to him. I couldn't hear what she said. The wind off the mall was doing what October wind does, which is swallow everything quieter than a shout, but I could see her lips move. Brief. Formal. A sentence or two. Whitmore said nothing. This is correct behavior. Guards don't respond. They don't engage. They stand there and they do not acknowledge the civilian world, and if a tourist presses their face 2 inches from a guard's face and screams, the guard does not blink. This is the whole point. This is the discipline. She spoke again. Longer this time. She opened the folio and half extended it toward him, not shoved it in his face, nothing aggressive, just offered it into the space between them the way someone offers documentation they expect to be taken seriously. Whitmore did not look at it. His eyes stayed exactly where they were. Forward. Fixed. Still. The man on her left leaned in and murmured something to her. She shook her head once, sharp, dismissive, and took a half step forward. That was when Whitmore moved. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of sudden physical escalation you see in the videos that go viral of guards finally snapping at tourists who've been dancing in their peripheral vision for 40 minutes. This was different. He stepped. One step. Diagonal. Precise. Planting himself between the woman and the gate behind him with the economy of motion that suggests the movement was always there, preloaded, just waiting for the right trigger. And he looked at her. Guards don't look at you. That's the rule. That's the whole contract. But he looked at her. Not a glare. Not aggression. Something worse, something that doesn't have a good word for it. The way a locked door looks when you've just realized it's been bolted from the inside and the person inside already knows you're there. The woman in the gray coat took a breath. I could see it from 30 feet away. One of the school children nearby said something and was immediately hushed by a teacher. The woman said something else to Whitmore. I caught one word on the wind and that word was authorization. Then, her male companion said something that ended with what sounded like the Duchess, and the female companion on her other side put a hand briefly on her arm and then withdrew it, which was the most human moment any of them had produced in the preceding 5 minutes. Whitmore said nothing. Moved nothing. Became, somehow, even stiller than he had been before. I want to try to explain what this felt like to watch, because stalemate at a palace gate should not be the kind of thing that stops your breathing. You should be able to catalog it clinically. Unusual situation, official-seeming woman, unresponsive guard. File it. Move on. But there was something happening inside this moment that I couldn't name yet, that I wouldn't be able to name for several more hours. A quality to the tension that felt less like bureaucratic friction and more like protection. Like the stillness Whitmore was performing was a specific kind of stillness. Not the trained blankness of ceremony. The kind you hold when you are standing in front of something and you will not move. The American woman next to me had her hand on her partner's arm. Something's wrong, she said quietly. Her partner looked at her. Wrong how? She shook her head. Didn't have the word for it either. None of us did, yet. The woman in the gray coat closed the folio. Stood for a moment. Then, she turned and said something to her 2 companions, low and fast, and the 3 of them moved back the way they'd come, not retreating, exactly, but reorganizing, the way chess pieces reorganized before the next move rather than after checkmate. They didn't leave the forecourt. They went to the far edge and stopped. Waiting. Whitmore's eyes moved back to their forward position. His shoulders settled a fraction. The breath he took was so controlled it was nearly invisible. Nearly. I checked the time. 9:30. The sky was doing that thing where it can't decide between cloud and weak sunlight, shifting the whole forecourt between gray and gold in a way that seems deliberately theatrical. A pigeon landed 6 inches from Whitmore's left boot and he ignored it with such absolute commitment that the pigeon looked confused. I should have left. I had somewhere to be. I stayed. Because there are moments, rare ones, the kind you can't manufacture or predict, where you're standing in the right place at the right time and something is building around you and every instinct in your body says stay still, pay attention, you are about to see something that matters. I had that instinct. So I stayed. And, about 11 minutes later, a car came through the interior gate. Not a tourist car. Not a staff vehicle. The particular black of a particular kind of car that the British establishment reserves for the particular kind of person whose movements are planned 3 days in advance and never announced. The forecourt shifted. Not in any obvious way, no one gasped, no one pointed. But, the energy changed, the way a room changes when someone important walks in, even before you've looked up and confirmed who it is. The American couple raised their phone again. The school children went quiet all at once, which is a remarkable thing when you stop to think about it. The woman in the gray coat, from her position at the far edge of the forecourt, turned to watch. And Corporal James Whitmore, 23 years old, from Shropshire, with a mother who sent him biscuits, stood where he was. One step ahead of that gate. Not moving for anything. Not for anything in this world. The car stopped. Not at the main entrance. Slightly before it. Which meant whoever was inside was either arriving or pausing, and, in the world of royal movement, those are two completely different things with completely different protocols, and every person in that forecourt who understood protocols, the guards, the staff, the quiet figures in dark coats near the interior doors, understood immediately which one this was. A pause. Someone had told the driver to pause. I've been back to this moment 100 times in my head since then. Tried to pick it apart. In the movies, there's always a clear shot, the window rolls down, a face appears, you see the moment of recognition. Real life doesn't do that. Real life gives you a tinted window and the stillness of a driver who has been told to wait and the absence of sound that isn't really silence, it's just the world holding what it knows. The woman in the gray coat had not moved from her position at the far edge of the forecourt. Her male companion was speaking quietly into a phone. Her female companion was watching the car. Whitmore was watching nothing. Or everything. It was genuinely impossible to tell. Here's what I knew about him, standing there watching, which was nothing. And here's what I would learn, later, in the hours and, then, days when this became a story that people needed to understand rather than just feel. He had been posted here for 7 months. Prior to this posting he'd done 2 years at St. James's Palace, which is not the famous posting, not the posting that gets the photographs and the tourists and the viral videos, but, which is, according to people who know more about this world than I do, the posting where you learn things. Where you pay attention in a way that's less about ceremony and more about the actual structure of what you're protecting. He'd been recommended for this posting by a senior officer whose name I was never able to confirm but who, by multiple accounts, was the kind of man who picked people for reasons rather than metrics. He had been briefed. That's what I would eventually understand. He had been briefed. Not in the full public inquiry, name in newspapers sense of the word. Briefed the way the close protection world works, which is that someone with the right clearance and the right concern tells someone with the right position and the right temperament that a specific situation requires a specific awareness. He knew who the woman in the gray coat was. He knew what the folio contained. And he knew because he had been told, or because he had worked it out, or because both of those things are sometimes the same thing, what she wanted to do with it. Her name was Elise Caro. I'll write that name here because it became public eventually, not in the way that the names of people who do heroic things become public, with celebration and profile pieces and morning television, but in the quieter way that names become public when the story they're attached to is the kind of story that certain people would prefer stayed private. Elise Caro. Senior investigative researcher. Formerly attached to a private intelligence firm that had, over the previous 18 months, been contracted by, and here is where the careful language begins, because this is the part where lawyers get involved and words like alleged and purported are in their keep by interests aligned with a part of the royal household that is not the part Kate Middleton occupies. The folio she was carrying contained materials. What kind of materials? This is the question that everyone asks and that I can answer only partially, because the partial answer is the only honest one. Documentation. Communications. Photographs, possibly, though this was disputed. Evidence, or the shape of evidence, built around a line of inquiry that had begun somewhere private and was attempting to move somewhere public, and to do so through a very specific institutional backchannel that required physical access to a specific person in a specific location. That person was inside the car that was paused in the forecourt. And Corporal Whitmore was standing between the car and the woman who wanted to reach it. I want to be honest about what I knew at the time versus what I'm telling you now, having assembled it from the pieces. At the time, standing in that forecourt at 9:30 on a Tuesday in late October, I knew none of this. I knew a woman in a good coat was being blocked by a guard who had decided not to move, and that the quality of the tension between them was unusual, and that a car had appeared and paused and not proceeded, and that none of the assembled members of the public were quite able to look away. I also knew one other thing. I knew because about 6 minutes after the car appeared and paused, a second figure came out of the interior door, not through the main entrance, through a side door that I'd never seen used before in all the times I'd stood in this forecourt, and this figure walked across the forecourt toward Whitmore with the specific briskness of a person who was trying to handle something before it grows. He was older. Senior by bearing, by the small differences in dress that mean nothing to civilians and everything to military people. He arrived beside Whitmore and said something. Brief. 2 sentences, maybe 3. Whitmore didn't respond. The senior figure said something else. Longer. Whitmore said one thing in return. 1 sentence. I was closer now than I had been. I'd moved without deciding to, one of those slow drifts toward something that your feet manage independently of your better judgment, and the wind had shifted, and I caught the last 4 words of what Whitmore said. Not until she leaves. The American couple heard it too. The woman gripped her partner's arm. Did he just, yeah, her partner said. We stood there, the 3 of us, strangers, not looking at each other, all watching the same thing with the same held breath. The senior figure went very still for a moment. Processing. Then, he turned to look at Elise Caro at the far edge of the forecourt. Then, back at Whitmore. Then, he did something I did not expect. He stepped back. Not far. Half a pace. But it was deliberate, and it was visible, and it was the kind of half pace that means I am not going to override this in the language of institutions that run on hierarchy, and no, in hierarchy is not the right tool. He turned and walked back toward the interior door. Whitmore didn't watch him go. Elise Caro waited another 9 minutes. I counted them, which tells you everything about how completely I had abandoned any pretense of having somewhere else to be. 9 minutes of the forecourt doing its ordinary thing around the extraordinary thing at its center. A fresh batch of tourists filtered in through the main public entrance and raised their phones. The school children were marshaled into a rough line by their teacher and began a slow circumnavigation of the forecourt perimeter. The pigeon came back and attempted a second engagement with Whitmore's boot. Elise Caro spoke to her 2 companions. Twice. Short exchanges. The male companion got off his phone and they all 3 stood in that particular way of people deciding something. Then, she walked back to Whitmore. This time she didn't stop 8 feet away. She stopped 4. That's close. I want you to understand this, inside the space that guards are trained to make feel impassable. 4 feet from a man in full ceremonial dress with a rifle is close enough to be a statement. She said something that took about 45 seconds. I watched his face for 45 seconds and I want to tell you that something moved across it, some flicker of doubt or recognition or human response to being spoken to by another human being from 4 feet away, but I'd be lying. Nothing moved across it. When she finished, he said 3 words. I heard them clearly. Step back, ma'am. There's a tone that lives in those 3 words that I don't think I can fully describe in writing, but I'm going to try. It wasn't aggressive. Wasn't cold. Wasn't the clipped performative authority of someone enjoying their own power. It was the tone of someone who has decided something and is communicating that decision in the most minimal possible form, because the communication itself is secondary to the decision, and the decision is final and has been final for however long this has been going on and will remain final for however long it continues to go on. Step back, ma'am. Polite. Absolute. Like a wall that says please. Elise Carroll looked at him for a long moment. I counted that 2-3 seconds, 4, 5, and somewhere in those 5 seconds I think she understood something that the previous 20 minutes had been building toward, which is that this particular obstruction was not going to yield to credentials or authority or time or proximity or persuasion. She stepped back. Not all the way to the far edge. Just enough. And then, she closed the folio, properly this time, the clasp snapping shut with a small sound that was somehow louder than anything that had happened in the last half hour, and she turned and said something to her companions, and the three of them walked out of the forecourt through the public entrance. Not a retreat. A withdrawal. There is a difference. But it had the same outcome. The car, somewhere in this, had moved. I don't know exactly when, sometime in those 9 minutes, I think, while I was counting, and it had gone through the interior gate and the interior gate had closed behind it. By the time Elise Carroll and her companions had cleared the forecourt, the person the car had carried was already inside, already somewhere in the deep quiet of the palace interior, safe in the specific way that the word safe means when you are a person whose safety requires other people to spend their careers standing in the cold. Whitmore was still at his post. He stood for another 40 minutes before the changeover came. I know because I stayed. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because I wanted to see what he looked like when he could finally stand down. Maybe because I needed to know whether the stillness would break when the obligation to maintain it was lifted. The changeover happened. The new guard arrived. The formal ritual of it proceeded with its usual precision. Whitmore stepped back, executed the turn, and walked. He walked past me close enough that I could have spoken to him. Close enough to see that his jaw was fractionally looser than it had been and his eyes had gotten some of their ordinary human quality back, the quality that the ceremony strips out during a posting and returns during the walk away. He didn't look at me. He looked at nothing in particular. A 23-year-old from Shropshire walking away from 40 minutes of holding a line that nobody standing in that forecourt fully understood yet. I thought about saying something. I thought better of it. Watched him go. I went to get coffee. There was a small place on the other side of the mall, one of those thin London cafes that's been there forever and serves espresso in cups that are the wrong size and tastes like the best thing you've ever had when your hands are cold and your mind is doing that low-frequency hum of having witnessed something it hasn't processed yet. I stood at the window with my too small cup and watched the gray and gold of the street outside and thought about those 3 words. Step back, ma'am. The coffee was hot. The window was cold. Somewhere in the city, a car was arriving somewhere or departing somewhere, and the person inside it didn't know, or knew, or half knew, one of those gradations of palace knowledge that I didn't have access to and never would, that something had been held back on their behalf by a young man in a bearskin hat who had decided that this particular thing was not going to happen on his watch. My phone buzzed. Someone asking where I was. I texted back, coming. Got held up by something. Tell you later. I wasn't sure, yet, how to tell it. Turned out I'd need several more days and a story that hadn't finished unfolding yet before I'd find the words. The second part of this story doesn't start in the forecourt. It starts in a room I've never been inside. But it gets back to the same young man, standing still. Always back to that guard holds firm against Camilla, protects Kate Middleton from hidden investigation part 3, the line that held the story broke 4 days later. Not in one of the papers. Not from a reporter. It moved the way palace stories move when they're not supposed to move at all, in fragments, through people, one credible whisper finding another and the 2 of them finding 3 more until the shape of what happened becomes undeniable even though none of its specifics are confirmed and its most important names are still being carefully not set in print. I heard the first whisper from someone who worked adjacent to the Royal Press Office, not in it, adjacent to it, which is a specific kind of proximity that means you hear things and can't say them but also can't quite keep them to yourself at dinner, who told me, over a bottle of wine in a Soho restaurant on a Thursday evening, that something had happened at the palace earlier in the weekend, that it had involved a researcher and a guard and materials that certain people very much wanted to reach a very specific destination and had not. I said, I was there. He put down his wine glass. You were there? I saw most of it, I said. Didn't understand most of what I saw. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he told me what he knew. I'm going to try to give you the shape of it without flattening it into something neater than it was, because this story is not neat and the instinct to make it neat, to draw clean lines between the actors and the motives and the outcomes, is the instinct that lets us believe we understand things we only witnessed. What I was told, in that Soho restaurant, in the form that I can reasonably reconstruct and stand behind, there had been an investigation. Not official. Not parliamentary. The private kind, the kind that institutions occasionally conduct about other institutions when the usual channels are either too slow or too visible or too likely to produce results that certain parties would prefer not to be official. This investigation had been running for some months. It had been looking at Kate Middleton. At aspects of her public role, her communications, her relationships within the household. The specific focus I was not told, because my source either didn't know it or understood that telling me would cross a line that keeping the rest vague did not. The investigation had a connection, oblique, deniable, routed through enough intermediary layers to provide plausible insulation to someone whose interests did not align with Kate's. Someone whose position in the household meant that the existence of such an investigation would be, if it ever came fully to light, a significant and damaging revelation. The woman in the gray coat, Elise Caro, had been the delivery mechanism. The folio she carried contained a request, framed as documentation, formal, official-looking, the kind of thing that moves through institutions by looking like the thing institutions are designed to process, to begin a formal secondary review of certain materials. It needed to land with someone inside the palace. Specifically, it needed to reach a particular person with a particular role in a particular office that handled a particular kind of internal correspondence. It needed to bypass the front office. And, to bypass the front office, it needed access to the forecourt gate. Which is why she'd approached the guard directly rather than going through the formal entry protocols that would have generated a record and a timestamp and a name. Whitmore had known. Not because someone had handed him a briefing document with Elise Caro photograph and a list of bullet points. The palace doesn't work that way, and neither does the close protection world more broadly. He had known because somebody, the right somebody, in the right quiet way, had told him that in the coming days there was a possibility that someone might attempt an unusual approach to his post, and that the appropriate response to any such approach was not to be found in the standard ceremonial protocols. He'd been told to use judgment. He'd used it. That's the entire story, in one sense. A young man was told to use judgment and he used it, and the thing that was meant to happen didn't happen, and the person who was meant to be reached wasn't reached, and the investigation that was meant to proceed in a particular direction stalled in the forecourt of a palace at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning because a 23-year-old from Shropshire had decided, with perfect clarity, that not on my watch was a complete answer to any and all questions being put to him. But stories are never their own summaries. What I kept coming back to, in the days after that dinner, was the moment when his senior officer had approached him and he'd said those 4 words. Not until she leaves. This is not a ceremonial response. There is no protocol that produces those words. Those words come from a person who has made a decision that is larger than their role and has decided, correctly or not, with justification or without, that their role is the scaffolding for the decision rather than its limit. The senior officer stepped back. That step back is the part that undid me a little, if I'm honest. Because in any institutional hierarchy, the moment a junior person says not until she leaves to a senior person, the senior person has options. They can override. They can invoke authority. They can make the junior person's decision irrelevant by becoming the decision themselves, by physically moving to the gate, by finding another way to handle the situation that doesn't require the junior person's compliance. The senior officer didn't do any of that. He took half a step back and, then, he turned around and went inside. Which means one of 2 things. Either he agreed with Whitmore's judgment and chose to let it stand rather than complicate it. Or he had been briefed that this situation required exactly the kind of non-interference that a senior officer stepping back represents. My source, when I asked him about this, smiled into his wine. Sometimes the most powerful thing a senior person does is nothing, he said. And nothing looks a lot like one step backward. I sat with that for a while. There's a version of this story where Elise Caro is the villain and Whitmore is the hero and Kate Middleton is the endangered princess and everything resolves into its proper moral geometry. That version is easier to tell. It fits the shape we're used to. I don't entirely trust that version. What I know is what I saw. A woman tried to reach something. A man stood in her way. She left. The thing she was trying to reach was not reached. Whether what she carried was genuinely damaging or was itself a construction, whether the investigation was justified or manufactured, whether the protections in place were protecting someone righteous or simply protecting someone powerful, none of that was decided in the forecourt. None of that is ever decided in the forecourt. The forecourt only decides whether the line holds. That Tuesday morning, it held. 3 weeks after the restaurant conversation, I went back to the palace. Not for any particular reason. Or, no, that's not honest. I went back because I wanted to stand in the forecourt again, in the same air, and see if I could feel the residue of it. The way you return to a place where something happened and try to find the thing the place remembers. It was a bright day this time. Cold but bright, the kind of November London day that appears as though the sky has been washed and dried and hung back up. Tourists in heavier coats. Children on what looked like a different school trip, newer batch, same wide eyes. There was a guard at the southern post. Not Whitmore. Different build, different angle to the jaw, a stillness that was excellent but different, performed rather than inhabited, not yet the same thing. I stood for a while anyway. Thought about what it takes to stand that still in front of something and refuse. Not out of certainty that you're right. Not out of a briefing document or a clear protocol. Just out of the decision, made somewhere in the body below the level of thought, that this is where I am and this is what I'm doing and I will not move. The pigeon came back. Or a pigeon. They're hard to tell apart. It landed near the guard's boot, regarded the world with its characteristic blend of purpose and confusion, and then walked in a small circle and regarded it again. The guard ignored it with full commitment. I almost laughed. A month after that, I spoke to someone who'd been working in the palace on the day in question. Junior staff. The kind of person whose role means they observe without being observed, which is a position I have some sympathy for. She told me that word had moved through the staff quarters the way it always does, fast, incomplete, carrying more heat than light. She told me that what she'd heard was less about the specifics of the investigation and more about what Whitmore had done and what it meant. Most of them were proud, she said. But also surprised? Not that he'd done it. More that it had been allowed to stand. What do you mean? I asked. She thought about it. When a junior person does something brave in an institution like this, usually the institution closes around it. Absorbs it. Makes it not the story. But this one, it didn't get absorbed. It was just left there. Like a message. A message to who? She shrugged. Everyone who needed to hear it, I suppose. I never spoke to Whitmore directly. I considered it, in that idle way you consider things you know you won't do. What would I have said? I was watching. I'm glad you held. Which is true but insufficient. Or, what did it feel like, standing there, deciding that? Which is the question I actually want answered and the one least likely to get an honest response from a 23-year-old who has been trained, at a molecular level, to give no response at all. I read the photograph his sister posted, eventually. The one with 14,000 likes. My brother is literally a fancy statue. Thought about fancy statues. Thought about what they're usually for: commemoration, declaration, the marking of something that happened and shouldn't be forgotten. Thought about how statues are still and unchanging and rooted in, how that's usually a metaphor for something that has ended. But sometimes the stillness is happening right now. Sometimes it's a living person planting their feet in a forecourt on a cold gray Tuesday morning and deciding, with every one of the mechanisms that decision-making runs on: a training, briefing, instinct, something that doesn't have a name but lives in the chest and knows the difference between the things worth holding and the things worth letting go, deciding that this is the thing worth holding. And holding it. Here's what I keep coming back to at the end. The thing that stays with me past the details and the names and the diplomatic fog of how the rest of it played out. Kate Middleton, in that car, paused in the forecourt for reasons I still don't fully know, because the driver was told to wait, because the delay had alerted someone inside, because some invisible thread of the palace's nervous system had registered the obstruction at the gate and transmitted a signal to slow everything down until the gate situation resolved. She may not have known what was happening 40 feet away. She may have known exactly. The tinted window doesn't tell you which. But here's the image I carry: a car, paused. A gate, blocked. A young man in a bearskin hat between the two, facing forward, facing nothing, facing everything, holding still the way you hold still when stillness is the most complete act of courage available to you. Not dramatic. Not filmed. Not the kind of moment that gets a medal ceremony or a citation read aloud in a hall full of people in formal dress. Just standing there. Just not moving. Not until she leaves. And, sometimes rarely, in the specific circumstances that the world occasionally constructs just to see if the people inside it can meet them, sometimes that's enough.